First, I would like to introduce for the first time today, Dr. David Kelley, founder of the Atlas Society. Dr. Kelley earned his philosophy degree from Princeton in 1975 and founded the Atlas Society in 1990, serving as our executive director until 2016. Though he's technically retired, he remains active in our work, writing and editing articles, hosting webinars, and serving on our board of trustees. He is joined on stage by Rob Tracinski, who you all met earlier. And I'd just like to encourage you to dig into Rob's excellent pocket guides that he curates for the Atlas Society, including his most recent pocket guide to Ayn Rand. You guys should have that in your welcome bag. So if you want to get that out for this session, you're welcome to, or there's more copies on the back table. And also check him out on our Atlas Society X Spaces, formerly known as Twitter. He and other scholars dive into timely and relevant topics from a philosophical perspective. What is it, every other week, Rob? Or once a month? Once a month.
Yeah,
so
sometimes a little more often.
Yeah, so encourage you to follow us on Twitter and check those out. They have both joined us here today for a collaborative session on who is Ayn Rand and what is objectivism. All right, without further ado, off to you guys.
Well, I think the plan was I was going to kick off with the Ayn Rand part, and David's going to do the objectivism part. And this is a session, was partly conceived because we got a lot of people who are students here, people who might be new to objectivism and have, not have this knowledge of who Ayn Rand was, what her historical context was, the full context of her philosophy. So I'm going to go over the biographical part. So this little pocket guide that just came out, Pocket Guide to Ayn Rand, it's a very short, it's like a 30,000 foot view because I have to deal with in a relative, in a short digestible thing, I'm trying to deal with her biography, her novels, her philosophy, and then objectivism as a movement. It's a lot to cover. So we have even less time now, so this might be more of a view from the satellite view of things, not just even 30,000 feet. But I want to go over some key aspects of her life that I found to be interesting. So Ayn Rand is born in 1905 in Russia. She's born Elissa Rosenbaum. She changed, Ayn Rand is a pen name that she adopts later, partly to protect her family because she comes out of the Soviet Union. She's going to write a lot of critical things about the Soviet regime. She doesn't want her family punished for it. But she's born in 1905. This is like the tail end of the Victorian era, and there's this huge influence that the 19th century has on her in her youth. But it's interesting. There's two aspects of the 19th century that are often considered opposites. So on the one hand, she has a fascination with industry and technology. Obviously, this comes out in her novels, where the industrialism and the Tim Sandifer is an objectivist who's written some things about her relationship with Isabel Patterson, described them as being part of the airplane generation. The generation of people who grew up with the airplane as the cutting edge of amazing technological innovation and having this impact on them, and especially young women who had many more opportunities than women had had prior to that. So there's that modernism of the 19th century, the industry, the technology, the science, scientific advances, and the products of that, and the new modern era that's being born out of the 19th century. But at the same time, she's also influenced by the romanticism of the 19th century. And usually these are sort of considered opposites. You have the Enlightenment era, and you have reason and science, and then you have romanticism, was all about fiery emotion. Well, we know from Ayn Rand's, the mature work of Ayn Rand, she combines those two things. And you can also see that as an early influence on her, that she was, early on, she read the novels of Victor Hugo, and with his, one of the great towering literary figures of romanticism, and the emphasis on high drama and a great deal of emotional power in his work. So she has that early influence of those two elements from the era that comes before her, from the 19th century, of the fiery emotion of romanticism and then the logic and rationality of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, and sort of combining those two things. Now, the other big thing that happens, of course, in her early years is she's in Russia in 1905. What's about to happen? Well, the whole world's about to come crashing down. Right? There's the Russian Revolution and the imposition of communist dictatorship. And so, for example, she's briefly expelled from Petrograd State University as part of a purge of bourgeois students. And there was an international outcry, and it's reversed and she gets back in. But this is the sort of thing that was going on. There was a totalitarian takeover of the entire society going on when she's a college student. And so she realizes she has to get out. So in 1926, she manages to get a visa saying, oh, I'm sure I'm going to come back to Russia. And of course, she gets out and she never returns. She had no intention of ever returning. She makes her way to America. This is, again, satellite view, so we're going to leave out a lot of details. She gets to America, spends a little time with relatives in Chicago. But as part of this modern world, this combination of romanticism with the modern world, she wants to become a novelist because of Victor Hugo, but then there's this new medium of film, the movies. It's, brand new medium of telling stories, and she becomes highly interested in that from the Hollywood films she sees when she's still in Russia. So the first thing she does, after a couple months in the US, she heads off to Hollywood. And there's this great story about she's first full day in Hollywood. She's standing outside the gates of Cecil B. DeMille's studio. And for people who don't, Cecil B. DeMille was the most famous film director of that time. It's like Steven Spielberg maybe today, or somebody, or Christopher Nolan or whatever. The most famous film director at the time. She's standing outside the gates of his studio, first full day, and she sees the man himself. Cecil B. DeMille comes up in a car and he's talking to somebody and she's staring at him. And he comes over and says, so why are you looking at me? She says, well, I know who you are, and I'm a big fan. I've just arrived from Russia, and I want to write for the movies. So he says, so we'll hop in to the car. If you want to write for the movies, you should see how they're made. He brings her into the studio, gives her a studio pass, says, you hang out and watch everything. She ends up being an extra in the film King of Kings, which is this great biblical epic, which I think is very amusing. And then she gets a job in the scenario department. The scenarios are basically, you're evaluating it's a short summary of a plot for a film. So she's evaluating those. So she sort of gets her start on the very first day meeting Cecil B. DeMille in person. It's one of these great sort of coincidences. She works in Hollywood for a while, not hugely successful, but she has, a few things produced. She has a play that she writes, a murder courtroom drama, murder mystery, very intriguing play. It was done under the title Night of January 16th. The gimmick in it is that the audience is the jury, right? So the evidence is presented, and then the audience has to vote as to whether guilty or not guilty, and two different endings are performed depending on that vote. And that gets her, that play gets, I think she produced it in Hollywood first, and then it gets picked up and it goes to Broadway. And so she moves to New York City, and she comes to New York City and she meets Isabel Patterson. Now, Isabel Patterson at the time was a sort of a literary columnist. She writes for the New York Herald Tribune, I think it was. And she's also this tremendously self-taught, wide range of knowledge. So she sort of becomes the protege of Isabel Patterson, and that sort of introduces her to the literary circles in New York City, and also helps expand her knowledge of history and politics and all of that. But what's going on at the time is, so Ayn Rand arrives from Russia in the US just in time for the Red Decade. Anybody heard that term? The Red Decade is a term used to describe the 1930s. It was a time in which among the intellectuals, there was a tremendous vogue, a sort of a fashion for communism. Oh, communism is the way for the future. The Soviet Union is this new paradise that's being built, the workers' paradise that's being built. And so there's a tremendous positive view of communism. And here she is just coming out of Soviet Russia and knowing the exact opposite is true. And that inspires her. First of all, the first novel is called We the Living, which is inspired by her experiences as a student, basically showing this collectivist, totalitarian takeover of society, and these individualist heroes who are trying to resist that. But then what really prompts her, the Red Decade and also the New Deal, which is this vast expansion of government based on these similar sort of collectivist principles that emerges as a response to the Great Depression. In reaction to that, she goes out and she writes The Fountainhead, which is taking on this idea of the individual versus collectivism. And it's this anthem of individualism. And specifically, what she wanted to show it as, this is about, she described the novel as being about individualism versus collectivism, not in politics, but in man's soul. So she presents the ultimate conformist, the person who has the collective in his soul, right? It is, in his mind is always a matter of what do other people think, and I should conform to that. And then she has her hero, Howard Rourke, who is the pure individualist, the man who has, the collective is not in his soul anywhere, that he always thinks in terms of what's true, what do I think, and not what do other people think. So she takes that issue that, of communism versus capitalism, or the New Deal versus what came before, and she distills that down to, well, let's look at individualism versus collectivism on this really basic level in your soul. And this novel becomes sort of a word of mouth. It goes famous by word of mouth. It's poorly reviewed. The intellectuals don't want to hear it because it's anti-collectivist. But on word of mouth, it becomes this sort of breakaway best-selling hit. She returned. Now, here's the interesting thing. She returns to Hollywood, now famous and with the contract to work on a script for a feature film version of The Fountainhead. And she also gets a job with Hal Wallace, a major Hollywood producer, to work on a couple of films. And she does a couple of films there. But the project she gets, I think, is fascinating, especially last summer they had, last summer was what they called Barbenheimer. And the two big movies were Barbie and Oppenheimer. So this giant movie that just came out about Oppenheimer, Ayn Rand got the first crack at that. For Hal Wallace, one of her projects was to do a movie about the development of the atomic bomb. And she actually went off and interviewed a bunch of the top scientists, did several interviews with Robert Oppenheimer as the basis for this. And the conclusion that she brought from the film and that she wanted to put into it. Now, it's one of these Hollywood things where, they bring her in, they have her do all this work, and then the thing gets canceled, right? I think actually there were two people working on two different films and her project got sort of closed down so that it could be merged in with the other film. So, but from this, she gets a big idea. She realizes that, the atomic bomb, this thing that, definitively won the war, this shows the power of the human mind. That the war wasn't won by bullets and steel and by the number of men that you had in the field. The war was won by the ability to invent something. And she talked to part of their interview with Oppenheimer. That in her notes she underlines it. She says nobody ever gave an order at Los Alamos. Is one of the things that Oppenheimer said. Is that we had intellectuals, we had scientists who were working on this project. This wasn't done by issuing orders and having everything done by the top down. It was done through the creativity and ingenuity of the people we had working for us. And so she had this theme about the role of the mind, the central role of the mind and of thought in human life. And she gets that idea out of this project. She starts looking around for, well, how can I, this is such a big idea, she wants to use it. That's where she comes up with the idea of Atlas Shrugged. And the idea of, well, what happened, and then it also comes out of a conversation she has with a friend about, well, what would happen if all the people who run everything, who come up with all these ideas, what if we quit? What if we went on strike? And then she has to say, well, that's the idea for the novel. What if all the people who are coming up with the big ideas and doing the intellectual work to make the world run, what if they didn't do their work? And that's her way of illustrating that goal. Now, in the process of doing this, of writing this novel, she always said her goal in writing the novel was to come up with the characters, the John Galt and Howard Rourke, and the heroes. My favorite is Dagny Taggart. I read this when I was young, and I fell in love with Dagny Taggart. She's my favorite character probably from all of the novels. The goal was to come up with these characters and show us these characters. So it was the artist's goal of I'm going to portray these characters taking these actions, but in the process, she comes up with a lot of big philosophical ideas. And Atlas Shrugged is very much a philosophical novel. So after that, she becomes incredibly famous, even more famous than from The Fountainhead. But she also finds people are clamoring for, we want to hear more about these ideas in the novel. So she transitions to then, after that, she writes nonfiction. She transitions to basically creating the philosophy of objectivism, writing it down, fleshing it out, over a period of about roughly 15 years, basically from about 1960 to 1975, she writes down most of these important ideas. And it not only becomes a more fleshed out philosophy, but it also becomes a movement. And I think there's some interesting aspects, I'm over my time here, some interesting aspects of how the movement was created, but and the effects it has still to today, and the fractiousness of it and all of that. But it's this last period of her life where she transitions from being a novelist to then saying, wait a minute, in the process of writing these characters and coming up with these scenarios, this interesting idea behind the novel, interesting theme behind the novel, she comes up with some profound philosophical ideas. And she spends the next 15 years writing those down, lecturing on them, and sort of fleshing out the philosophy of objectivism. And then until and then in 1982, she succumbs, and she passed away in 1982. and leaves that philosophy, as well as the novels that illustrate them, to us. All right, so that's the 70,000-foot view of her life.
Okay, well, I'm going to go to 10,000 feet now on the philosophy of objectivism. It is a comprehensive philosophy, and I'm a philosopher by training, so I've been studying this all my life. But I'm going to give you a kind of a snapshot view, the same snapshot view that Ayn Rand gave. She was asked, what is your philosophy? And for those who are not so familiar with the idea, with the study of philosophy, or the idea of, I have a short paragraph from me. What is philosophy? It's a comprehensive system. It's on the handout, and you can read it. But when Ayn Rand was asked that question, she was asked that in a marketing, I believe it was a marketing meeting for Atlas Shrugged. Ms. Rand, can you summarize your philosophy standing on one foot? She was not an athlete, but she did it. She carried it off. And what she said is in this philosophy standing on one foot: metaphysics, objective reality; epistemology, reason; ethics, self-interest; politics, capitalism. Now, you could imagine doing that on one foot, but each of those has potentially volumes of thought and effort and understanding that lies behind it in her development of the philosophy, but also in our understanding of it as students. I'm going to spell out each of these points, but I want to make one structural point first. This is laid out: metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics. Now that is a logical order philosophically, in terms of a philosophical system. Because working from the bottom, the last tier, you can't really have a theory about a good society, a proper society, unless you know the ethics of what individuals should be doing with their lives. How can you have a system for how they should interrelate before you know what the people who are going to relate are doing? What's the function of government? Well, what do we need government for? And that gets back into ethics. And ethics, how do you frame an objective ethics? How do you understand, of all the ethical systems in the history of the world, there's a fair amount of overlap, actually, more than you might expect from some of the basic differences. But there is, it is still a topic of great debate among people in philosophy, and for that matter, in many other disciplines, literature, theology, and so forth. But Rand said you can't understand where values come from unless you ask, why does man need values? Why do human beings need to have values in order to live? And life is the key here. It is the phenomenon of life, living beings. And she applied this to all living organisms, plants and animals, and not just humans, which is kind of a radical step, that all of them face the alternative of life or death, which means existence or non-existence. They pass away out of existence. Now, humans are special because we have the mind, we have the power of reason, which includes the power of choice. And so we have to choose our values. Well, how would we choose them? Well, by mystic revelation, by the authority of sacred books, or no, she says by reason. That is how we live, that is how we survive, that is part of our ethological capacity for pursuing, think of it in ethological terms. Any animal has a certain niche it lives in. It has needs that to get from that niche, and it has powers or capacities or abilities to do so. Well, humans are animals, of course, and only our niche is the universe, potentially. And we need, our key tool is our rational faculty. But what is reason? If you heard Stephen's talk this morning, you know there's a long history of assaults on reason, assaults including the postmodern and critical thinking movements of today. Rand was a stout defender of reason, but as the basis for that is there's a world out there. You know, as one philosopher said, and he was kind of on our side on this issue. He titled he was giving a presidential address of the American Philosophical Association, and the title was, "Yes, Virginia, there is a real world." If you don't believe in a real world, there's no basis for reason. If reason is undermined, there's no basis for the ethics, and in that case, your politics is anything goes. So let me, with that overview of structure, I want to, instead of working from the top down, I want to go right to the middle, the ethics, because that, I think, it was the core of what motivated and drove Ayn Rand in her thinking. The novels clearly are examples of presenting an ideal of what humans could be and how they can relate. And her heroes, Howard Rourke, the architect in The Fountainhead, and John Gall, Dagny Taggart, and the other top industrialists in Atlas Shrugged are all heroic beings. They are, and heroic not because they go and slay dragons or fight wars or rescue damsels out of the jaws of death. Although the latter case they probably would. But they're heroes because they are committed to changing the world, bringing value into the world, making the world reflect what their vision of a new metal or a railroad that runs on time or a new form of electricity in Gall's case. So, and their heroism is reflected in their long hours, their taking risks, their setbacks, but it's all for a goal of production. And so that was what got her, I think, was the driving force in her movies, and a key part of what most of us get out of the novels, at least the first time we read them. I remember I read The Fountainhead in high school, and I said, yeah, Howard Rourke, I want to be like him. And she later said, and as much as said, that from that ethical core of the ideal person, she worked back philosophically to what traits do humans have to possess, and exercise to meet that ideal of inaction. And reason came out, and she developed a whole theory of reason, a whole epistemology. And then, but that epistemology depends on the world. I mean, a key part of the epistemology is the primacy of existence. The facts are facts. The world is there. And the function of reason is not to make things up, but to grasp what is there. So that's why metaphysics and epistemology are important to ethics. But once you have a good ethical system, a solid philosophical vision of how people can live and what the virtues are, what the values we pursue, the rational values we should pursue, then you can address philosophical issues. And she advocated capitalism because she thought if people live by the ethics of being productive, being independent, being just and fair in their dealings with others, engaging by trade, that is by voluntary exchange to mutual benefit, that's the human way of acting. And what we need government for, what we need a political system for, is to make that possible, to enable people to engage in that. And with that philosophical basis, she drew on a lot of the work of the Founding Fathers. We need limited government, individual rights, and she didn't get into the details of political theory, but I think she would have recognized the need for separation of powers, in the federal government and between feds and states. But her main focus was capitalism. Let people free. And there should be a separation, as one of her famous lines, there should be separation of state and economy in the same way there is a separation of church and state. People in business should have the same freedom that intellectuals have to speak their minds. So that's a Cook's tour. We wanted to leave some time for questions. Some of you, I know, are very familiar with the philosophy, others maybe not so much. So let's open it up to questions for Rob or me.
Is there? Yeah, there you go. The mic is on its way.
No. Mr. Ryan.
Can you hear me? Okay. I guess it's my fault for not reading the book fully, the actually like epistemological book that she wrote, the introduction. But I guess my main question after hearing all the introductions was, I mean, I hold absolutes as like a given, but I guess I'm curious, where do objectivists take their absolute from? Because I think empirically all of her ideas are very, very sound, like reason, and I mean, you can just look at modernism and see that it's empirically sound, but I guess, like, for example, like, I think art, taking art as like a metric for like the state of culture, how do you look at art in a objective fashion, and like, where do you take your absolutism from, I guess, if not from religion?
Well, I'm going to answer one of those parts, which is, you want to know about art? I'm doing a session on that tomorrow morning. So that'll be a fuller answer. And I get into that if we have time, but I want to get...
Sure. The theory of art is often regarded as a fifth branch of philosophy, aesthetics. And Ayn Rand developed a short book, but a book of essays that are very insightful and powerful about the role of art and how it can project a moral ideal, but how it taps into our sense of what life really is, good or bad. I mean, that's why the tragedies are, you know, not every novel has to sing the praises of a hero. But that was just too much to get into, and as Bob is doing the whole story tomorrow.
I don't want to steal my thunder for tomorrow. But let's talk about the absolutes part, which is, where do absolutes come from? And they do come from observation. But this is something I want to say is very important to me in my sort of process of discovering objectivism. So I actually wanted to be a philosopher before I discovered Ayn Rand. And so I actually started out arguing against Ayn Rand's ideas with a friend of mine. This friend of mine read the Fountainhead, got interested. He was making all these objectivist arguments. Like, oh, no, that's all completely wrong. Let me argue back. And then I got to a point where I realized, all right, I have to go to the original source, read what Ayn Rand had to say, and figure out, you know, basically read it so I could refute it, right? And that didn't work out the way I thought. But I still resisted it. Like I said, I was very interested in philosophy. So I went to that book on epistemology. Ayn Rand's Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. And because this is after reading Atlas Shrugged, I said, I got to go back down to the roots of it, the philosophical roots. So I get to that. And the chapter that really got me was the one on axiomatic concepts. And I think this is the one that has the answer to what you're asking, which is, where do the foundational premises of this philosophy, the absolutes from this philosophy, where do they come from? And that's where she deals with this question of, well, how is it do we know? How is it we can have axiomatic ideas, basic ideas, you know, that reality is what it is, the law of identity, the absolutism of reality. How do we know that that's true? Where do these basic concepts come from? And her answer is, it comes from observation, but it's not coming from observation, you know, a specific physical law. You might do an experiment, and you have very sort of concrete and specific observations under specific conditions that allow you to make that conclusion. So the big ideas, you know, the big foundational absolutes of the philosophy are ones that are, you don't just observe them in one place, you observe them everywhere. They are so pervasive in every single observation you have of reality that these become the foundational ideas, that they are in everything that you observe, and implicit in everything you observe, and you can't deny them without assuming them, right? You can't, if I want to deny the law of identity. I can say, well, the law of identity is wrong. It says, well, how do you know what is wrong as opposed to right? If I say contradictions can exist, or there is no such thing as the contradictions can't exist. So, well, how do you know that this is true? That your position is different from another position, unless there's such a thing as things have a specific identity and there are contradictions, right? So, the sort of things that are so pervasive you can't deny them without relying on them, and they are implicit. They're present in every single observation you have in the world. So they are these super empirical conclusions, right? Because it's not just this is an empirical conclusion I draw from one observation or one set of observations. They're there in everything, and that's so the root of the absolutes at the basis of the system are empirical, but it's like super empirical because they come from every single thing you've ever observed.
And they are undeniable. I mean, if you say, if someone says, well, that contradictions could exist, and I say, you mean they can't exist? That's a contradiction, but on your standard, contradictions are okay. So we're both right? But if I'm right, you're wrong. So anyway, these are brain chasers. But let's go on to other questions.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm interested in the nature versus supernatural beliefs of objectivism. Is it basically that she's saying there's definitely nothing other than what we've already been able to measure? Or is she saying that whatever exists, exists whether we've been able to measure it or not? So there could be things that we don't understand or have ways of measuring yet that now we think of it as supernatural, but like maybe we'll find ways to measure it later, like other dimensions or, like, does that make sense? Like,
I think I get where you're going with that.
yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure I could hear clearly.
Okay.
So.
All right. So the question is, let me sort of rephrase a little bit. The question is, what about natural versus the supernatural? And Ayn Rand, being an atheist, rejected the idea of the supernatural. Says, but what is the basis for that? There are things that we are able to measure, the things we're able to understand, but what about something that we might be able to understand that would seem supernatural now that we might be able to understand later? All right. So I guess that's the direction you're going. I think I've got it. Okay, so first of all, this goes back to that issue of the foundational ideas, foundational principles that are absolutes, that are implicit in everything we observe. So part of the problem with the idea of the supernatural is you're looking out and you're saying, everything in the world around you, everything you've ever observed, everything you've ever had experience with, follows certain basic natural laws. And then if somebody says, well, no, but that's not really the case, there's something else, well, it's something that literally contradicts every single part of your experience. And I think you're entitled to then reject the idea that there's going to be something that somehow contradicts every single part of your experience. Now, it is also true that you will encounter new phenomena that will act differently. And I think there's a great, Arthur C. Clarke, a science fiction writer, came up with 3 laws of science fiction. And one of them is, Clarke's third law is that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I'd like to sort of reverse that, is that there are things that definitely we will encounter that we don't understand now and that are beyond our ability to account for given the current laws, physical laws. But when we encounter something like that, we just need, we have a lot of experience to show that, well, what we need to do is just understand new physical laws. So it may be something we don't understand now, but it will be something that is capable of scientific understanding, that has its own laws. And that's based on, what do we base these assumptions on? On the fact that something that's supernatural literally has no cause, or something that's contradictory. This is contrary to literally every single experience we've ever had of the world.
Yeah, this is the argument, as I understand it, is sometimes referred to as the God of the gaps. The gaps in our knowledge have to be filled with something supernatural. But the ignorance is not a basis for knowledge. It's just ignorance. If there's something we don't know, we can, if it's important, and many things that we don't know are important, let's go find out.
And actually, I found this a fascinating thing. I was looking up the God of the gaps argument, and the guy who came up with it was a religious believer, a theologian, but he didn't like that argument because he says if your basis for arguing for God is the gaps in our knowledge, God gets smaller every year.
He does. Yeah, that's the point.
Because the minute if you've ever debated a creationist, which I made the mistake of doing once or twice, if you ever debated a creationist, this is their whole argument. It's like, well, okay, sure, you can explain the evolution of this animal and this animal, but what is the other animal over here? There's a gap, we can't explain that, therefore God must have done it. And then, of course, what happens is 2 years later, somebody finds a new fossil, and we know exactly how that thing evolved. And God gets smaller every year. And I think that this guy was trying to avoid that problem, but it's an unavoidable problem for the supernatural, is that the supernatural as an explanation gets smaller and smaller every year as we discover new things and are able to explain more.
This is not an argument, but it's a reflection I often have when I hear this issue. I'm not a doctor, but I know enough about anatomy and physiology to know what an amazing thing a human being is. All the neurons that are connected somehow get wired up from birth on to mid-20s or so, and continue to develop since after that, of course. But the illnesses and the immune system that fights them off, and we're just one species, right? There are millions of species. And then what about plants and mollusks? And if you ask me, okay, David, we're going to extend your lifetime by 200 years. Would you design a world? It's staggering. I cannot imagine when they just refer to a God who is responsible for this. I think I cannot imagine a mind capable. I don't know what that would mean. I mean, they say he's omnipotent and omniscient. Okay.
But that's not an explanation of anything.
That's a description. Doesn't explain much. I'm an epistemologist, so I always think about, okay, if we know this, how do we know it? And that's just a side film point, so I won't dwell on it anymore, but it's just, it puzzles me. So we have time? Yeah.
Yeah, we got time.
All right, I'll try to make it as short as possible. First of all, thank you for having us. It's been lovely to hear you. I am a liberal, not just in American way, but more in the Austrian way, right? And I've seen that we have a lot of things in common. But I would like to ask, in a world that it's going towards an idea like populism, many countries are following that, how do you defend a philosophy that is not as sexy, right? We are talking about the individual has to take responsibility for their actions, and most of the people will prefer to just be babies their whole life and just take daddy government's money and just exist and just give the vote each year, right? So when it comes down to the war of ideas, what's a good way for us to try to open up to other people, thinking that not everyone has the same education or way of, actually rationalize most of these ideas?
Well, I can give an initial answer to that, which is, show of hands, when people discovered Ayn Rand, how many discovered her through her novels? Right, and that's like at least half the people here. And the answer to your, how do you sell this philosophy of individualism when people want to be taken care of? Well, not everybody wants to be taken care of. I mean, I sort of describe this as a paradox of, why is socialism so popular among the young when it's basically the social and political equivalent of moving back into your mom's basement, right? And what most young people actually want is they want to go out and be independent. They want to go out and create stuff. They want to be successful. They want to be, doing something independent on their own. And that is, that's the sales of Ayn Rand's novels, the fact that she sold millions of copies, has to do with the fact that people liked Howard Roark. They wanted to be like Howard Roark. People fell in love with Dagny Taggart. They wanted to be someone like that. They wanted to be out there taking charge of their own lives. I think there's a tremendous appeal in the idea that you can take charge of your own lives. And I also know that, so one of the places where India has, where objectivism has been very strong is in India. And I have a number of friends who are Indians who came to America, but who encountered her ideas back there. And there's tremendous appeal to it because it's a culture that is very collectivist in a particular way, that you're supposed to do everything for your family. You're supposed to have an arranged marriage, and the family is supposed to take precedence over your individual happiness. And they, reading Ayn Rand, especially The Fountainhead, has become a rite of passage for young people in India because it's a way of saying, no, maybe you don't have to do this. Maybe you can pursue your own happiness, decide the course of your own life. So I think that idea of independence and controlling the course of your own life is tremendously appealing. I think that's the heart of the appeal of this philosophy, is it says not only can you do that, but here's how, right? Because you also get the fact that the alternative often to collectivism or to religious traditionalism, the alternative is sort of nihilism or subjectivism. You just do whatever you want, and of course that's not any guidance either. That's how do I know how to live? Just do whatever you feel like isn't going to get you. It seems like chaos and anarchy, and it leads to bad results often. So it also provides this model for, well, not only can you control your own life and make something of yourself and be independent, but here's some examples of characters who are doing that. And we mentioned earlier, you mentioned something in passing that I think is really important, that Ayn Rand was influenced by Romanticism and this idea of these heroes doing great things. But what made her so unusual compared to other Romantic writers is her idea of be a hero doing great things is invent a new metal, run a railroad. Nobody ever thought to take this activity, the tremendous achievements of the Industrial Revolution, the people inventing new kinds of steel and creating and building the railroads and all that. Nobody had thought of making that into these sort of epic stories of adventure. Yeah. And that was what she did, that I think was actually the most radical thing she did in a way, was this vision of, okay, you want to be a hero, you want to do great things, you want to take control of your life, and you can do that by being a scientist or being an inventor or or a businessman, etc.
Yeah. I would just say that there, in the concrete, when you're trying to work with people, be with people, talk with them about issues where there are very conflicting ideas, that is actually a subject that a lot of people give in a lot of good thought to these days with all the polarization. There's a book, I can't remember the author, but the title is How to Have Impossible Conversations. And actually, we have two experts at doing that here, Brent Hamachuk and Felissa Blazik. So if you get it, I don't see them here, so they're, but they'll be around, and they can tell you about their work. But the thing is, when you have a disagreement, I think just the question, being like a 2-year-old, why? Mm-hmm. Can you tell me why you believe that?
All right.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Why?
Abby's
Sorry, I'm trying to cut you guys off. I just want to make sure we've been behind all day, and I want to get us back on time. So it's 12:15. We are going to break, and the scholars are going to be out here by the registration table. If you want to keep talking to Rob and David about this, you have extra questions, they'll be out here for the next 15 minutes. We have lunch starting at 12:30 down in the Potomac Ballroom where we were last night. And then sessions resume at 1:30 with breakouts. So we'll be back up here for 7 Habits of Highly Objective People at 1:30 with David and Stephen. And then downstairs, Richard Salzman will be doing The Need for Selfish Philanthropy. So check out your written schedules. Go out, chat with the
Thanks for watching. Want to see some more Ayn Rand? Hit that subscribe button below, like the video, and I'll see you next time.